You're listening to the Scaling Culture podcast, where we sit down with thought leaders who share their experiences building incredible workplace cultures. Our guest today, Chris Deaver, a culture and leadership visionary with an impressive background that includes influential roles at Disney and Apple. Chris has dedicated his career to understanding and shaping workplace culture, focusing on themes like co-creation, people empowerment, and leadership transformation. His insights challenge traditional leadership paradigms and encourage leaders to embrace curiosity, empathy, and brave spaces in their teams. In this episode of Scaling Culture, Ron and Chris discuss how can curiosity unlock new dimensions in leadership? Can ego be replaced with empowerment? How do we create not just safe spaces, but brave spaces? And what's the secret to balancing honesty and empathy? And is empowerment the future of leadership?
Welcome to another episode of the Scaling Culture podcast. I'm your host, Ron Lovett, and today we're honored to have Chris Deaver with us, who's the co-founder of Brave Core and the author of Brave Together. Chris, from California, welcome to the show, my man.
Thank you. Excited to be here, Ron. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I was so intrigued with your background. You really have I'm going to call it a full cycle, full circle background. You don't just you're not a researcher. You've lived on all sides of the fence, it seems. Is that fair?
I think so. Yeah. I don't know how to categorize myself, but I like that description. I think that fits well.
Yeah, because it should give you experience on all sides on following, leading, being in an interesting company, speaking, facilitating, you're educating, you're really living in the full sphere of culture. You're drinking from the Kool-Aid at all sides, I guess, you know?
Yeah. And it's fun. I think there's so much about, culture that we haven't explored, that can really make an impact on the world and in changing our lives. Yeah.
So can you give us and give the listeners just a high level summary of what got you into this? Why do you even give a shit about culture?
Yeah, if you go back far enough, my experience in seeing the world was really from an artist standpoint, and I studied animation years ago. That kind of got me to this creative sense of what should things be, right? Almost an ideal version of how things should feel, some of the pathos of it. And I've always had an interest in business and leadership. And, my dad was a scoutmaster, Boy Scouts for like 30 years. And so I got to be part of that starting age 10 and, observed a lot of different versions of leadership that sometimes worked well and others time, not as well. But I feel like...
I'm sorry, Chris, were you able back then to make an assessment of like, wow, this doesn't feel right, or wow, that worked? Like, what's an example of that at that age?
It's pretty easy. Like you're and either you're the leader, patrol leader, or somebody else is, and you got to put a pup tent together. And there's, 4 guys that are just making a mess of things for, way longer than it should take. And things like that, where you're observing and you're seeing how certain things work, certain things don't, and how, especially at that age, young men in particular, they either kind of follow somebody and listen or they don't. And they're pretty good at not really kind of doing their own thing. And you could notice certain things that people could do that would, inspire them. Maybe they're sharing a story, usually just the way that they embody the principles, right, that they're trying to lead by. That had an early impact on me. I deserve it. My father and how he led. He's a great man. But a lot of those things contributed to me just having a curiosity about leadership of the future. And in particular, what it could be. I got kind of grounded in the philosophy of Stephen Covey. He wrote the 7 Habits book, and I read that book, and I did a service mission in Peru, and one of the leaders there knew him really well, and so I learned the 7 Habits there. It was actually in Spanish, so I learned them, but I had such a curiosity about like, who is this guy? Like, what is the background? Like the man behind the curtain. And I got to meet him. He became a mentor, and that kind of grounded my thinking somewhat there. And then later at Disney, when I was working there, I met I guess really when I was at Apple after Disney, I got to know Ed Catmull, who started Pixar, and that creative sensibility about building a culture. He wrote a book called Creativity Inc., where he dives into the culture of Pixar. And kind of the combination of those things really interested me. Principles, timeless principles like the 7 habits, and then creativity, and how cultures and leaders can really shape the future with those things. And that's been my interest. Yeah.
Really interesting. I want to go back to the scout piece for a sec, because as you were saying that, I was thinking, so you have 3 kids, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Teenagers, 11, 14, and what was the other?
Or 15 and 17. Yeah.
15 and 17. Sorry. Right.
And the oldest, he's taller than I am now with the hair. He's, so I'm like, come on.
Without hair? Same.
Yeah. I'm like, hey, it took me 40 some years to get here. Come on, man. He's already like 6'3" or whatever. So,
well, look, I'm curious because, I think when I think about my children, and by the way, if I go to the baseline of leader, it's just having people follow you to whatever that is. Like really, like there's so many different types of leadership. I think Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall kind of broke the myth of leaders spiky. You could be a chess player that's blind and can't speak, and people follow you because you're a great chess player. You're spiky in something, right? And so, but I think my leadership has been challenged more than it ever has before, because trying to get my children to follow me to certain things has been way more challenging than adults, as complex as adults are with the nuances. And I remember this when you were talking about this tent story, right? It reminded me of this article I read where there was this frustrated mother who could not get her sons to follow her to putting the laundry away. That was her leadership, was like, I want you, the direction, which is follow my lead and getting your room clean, which is putting laundry away. She couldn't get it. She was having a nervous breakdown. And one day she had an idea to put a small little basketball hoop above the laundry basket. And all of a sudden the kids are shooting threes for the old laundry, and she nails it out of the park. Great example of how to conform to leadership in a different way. Was it that complex? Did you see anything back then that's like, oh my God, this is so complex? It's command and control. My son taught me last night does not work for him, right?
Yeah, no,
Would you agree? Is it more complex?
It's simple, right? And yet hard in the sense of like, we have to, pull away these obstacles that are self-imposed or ego sometimes. And like something like that, right? That she did that's co-creative, right? That's thinking in the context of like, what are the wants and needs of, the kids, and then blending, what she wanted. And I think that's where the power really is. I mean, I noticed that like in, my dad as a scout, as a leader, there are things where I think like, he's, I was dealing with him as a dad as well. I was like, well, there's a lot of things where I just like, it's just dad talk, he's just telling us what to do. And it's a classic. But then other times he'd just share a story, inspire you. And suddenly you're just doing that thing, right, that he wanted us to do or to accomplish. And sometimes it was like active engagement. I think what you're saying about, and whether it's sport, we do a lot of that, or just certain things where you just connect with where people are moving or where they want to move. And, that's kind of the energy, what can become perpetual motion, right? The elusive perpetual motion machine in science, they say that can't be created. It can actually be created through people power. And that's what happens in the best cultures.
Right. And look, I know when we did our research, in your bio, it says culture shaper, right? And so what does that mean to you? What is it? Because culture's so broad. Bring us through, what is shaping culture in your version of culture? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think at the core, the best version is co-creation, right? So we're here as as creators first, and then co-creators, right? There's a sense we talk about flow and how that matters, right? Stepping out of time, and that feeling when you're doing something you love. You could be in nature, could be art or sport, and or you're writing or just creating something that you love, and that's a special feeling, right, of being in the zone. And so that's important, and that matters because you're expressing your creative propensity, and that becomes more and more important in the future, right? In this future of, and regardless of industry, because over time we have focused on, we look back, right, the history of business as we know it, kind of the sense of efficiency, focus on the industrial worker, right, the assembly line. Frederick Taylor, Dale Carnegie spoke to like how to level up in that, be a salesperson, get to know people. Covey was focused on this time of like knowledge worker, right? There was a focus on effectiveness, hacks, hustle, optimization of habits, but all of that stuff is not enough in the future. For many reasons, partly because first of all, knowledge is ubiquitous now. You can find it on Google, you can find it on ChatGPT. Being the expert model leader doesn't really matter anymore, right? And this is what we saw this like years ago in the car industry. Like there was a point in time when I was, this is years ago, I was in college, I was selling cars, and it was like, but I didn't enjoy the job at all. But what I did enjoy was spending time with people. I didn't know anything about cars. All these other guys that showed up at the same time I did, they knew in and out about the cars. And so they're selling all the technical specs, right? And these customers are coming in and they already had Google. They didn't care about that stuff. What they wanted was just somebody to listen to them. And so I just listened. So I started selling the most cars of anybody. And I didn't even know. It was just like, I'm getting to these people and I'm connecting them with what they want. And that's, and if we look at it agnostic of anything else, the power of relationships doesn't go away with AI. The power of collectively building the future together. And so if we're thinking of companies like Pixar or Apple, where they create these incredible technologies, and I've observed this, where these teams come together, it's a co-creative experience. And so if we unpack what culture is on an individual basis, it's even true, right? Is like, well, how do I think about the space that's around me, right? And the space I occupy with others. Is it a space that is just, well, it could be dark matter, right? It could be fear-based, and that's not a good place, right? People don't enjoy those experiences. That's when they talk about toxic bosses or broken cultures. We've seen that. But the future, and people may lean into something else and say, well, it's safe space, and that's better than, the other alternative. But really, the ultimate is being in this brave space, which is we're breaking out of just, fear. We're breaking out of braving it alone, and we're braving it together. And as we do that, everything changes because we unlock creativity in each other. And then we can, start to create magic, right? Solutions that we would never thought of before.
But is there a line? So, for instance, when I first sold my security company and I launched Conley Owens, we wanted to create this, culture consulting business, and back then our strategic approach was, if you believe in culture, more servant leadership and empowerment, if you believe that's the way to go, and you just don't know how to execute, we're your team. But if that's not for you, we didn't want to try to convince you that was the way forward. Do you have a line that says, look, you're not looking to create a safe environment, so we're not going to talk, what's the line for you, or what's in the strike zone for you?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, because like so when I was working at Dell years ago, they were in a moment that was really crazy, right? The sky was falling for them. They were having rifts every 3 or 4 months. The 3 VPs that hired me left after 3 months. It was brutal. And we had, then I went to Disney and we had Simon Sinek come speak, and, I got to know him a little bit, and we were talking about Dell, and he's like, well, some companies I work with, some I don't, it depends on where they're at as far as their mindset. And I felt the same way. Like you can only take them so far, right? If the patient is willing, right? And sometimes if it's like extreme surgery on the patient as in the culture itself. And if we're talking about cultures that have already been in motion, or there's already some inertia there, it can make it harder. I had the opportunity though, if we take Dell as an example, to end up, spending a lot of time with some of the senior leadership, Michael Dell, doing some coaching on culture. And I saw, hey, there's things that it made it a fixer upper, but there were other elements that really you could amplify, right, to make it even become more great. And one of those things was just I think a baseline humility. So if you strip everything away and say, if a leader can look themselves in the mirror rather than looking other places to blame, and they can say, what do I need to do differently?
And what's my responsibility here, right?
That's the ultimate question. So if we have that as a starting point, we can start getting somewhere. And I found that to be true. Yeah.
Right. So if you couldn't get to that starting point, it was kind of like, look, we're just spinning our tails here. Spinning our wheels. Chasing our tails.
And you can tell, right? Like some leaders, it's just like they know everything. Everybody else is stupid, or they have an agenda, right? That's so locked in that they don't care what anybody else thinks,
Right.
and you just can't, it's too much ego. But usually those people find out, say the hard way at some point, it hits the fan. Yeah.
And so you mentioned Apple and Disney. Now, were you working there or as a consulting capacity? What was the relationship?
Yeah, I was inside those companies,
Okay.
and I kind of took it on myself to, similar to with Dell, to really look at it from a consultant perspective inside the company.
And what role were you playing ish? I mean, you probably moved around a bunch, but
Yeah, mainly like HR business partner.
okay.
And, there's programmatic stuff you do in a role like that, but I was always curious about other things. And I don't know if that's just a little bit of the rebel in me or misfit. I like, there's certain things you think, okay, they're, talent development, leadership, but I was curious about where is this culture going? And if the culture is a person, right? What's the future version of that person look like? First of all, what is it like today? And you get to know these, and it's actually quite interesting. And I don't know there's certain books that have alluded to these things, but you look at a Disney, and they're pretty old. They've been around for 80, 90, some 100 years. So and they kind of have this grandfatherly quality about their culture, very nostalgic, and but sometimes slow moving and bureaucratic. And so it was opportunistic when they bought Pixar, and they infused this new kind of energy, into the heartbeat of animation. This also led to, Ed and Steve Jobs. They helped broker these deals with Marvel and Lucasfilm to infuse this different kind of energy. And so it's kind of like a grandfatherly figure, but just taking on an infusion of energy and enthusiasm and acting like a, 40, 50-year-old man or trying to. And, you get to Apple, I got to Apple and it was like, well, this is probably about, 40s, 50s. And it's, he's got a couple of kids, and it's kind of figured out who wants to be. And then you have others, and it's not always correlated with the years, but I think also the companies that have a sense of intention about their future. Like I think of the movie Interstellar, Chris Nolan, I'm a big fan of his movies, and Matthew McConaughey was in that movie, and he spoke at the Academy Awards at one point, and they asked him, or he said somebody had asked him about who's his mentor, and he said, well, most people would think it's going to be some actor. He said, no. He said, my mentor is me in 10 years. And I didn't really understand what he's talking about until I watched that movie. And I don't want to spoil it for everybody if you haven't seen it, but there's a part in there where he's in the future, and he's basically trying to teach his past self and bring his past self into the future. And I think that's the ultimate question of cultures, to do that in the best way. And in this case, he's really trying to save himself and his family, right? All the humanity. And I think the question for cultures is, what is that future version of yourself? What are the first principles as to how you could actually create that? And then what are the sacrifices you have to make to do it? And more often than not, one of the big sacrifices is going to be some version of ego, right? Laying down that. And that's the hero's sacrifice, right? We talk about the hero's journey, and we love the part of at the end with all the rewards, right? We slayed the dragon and all that. The part that's the hardest is the hero sacrifice. But if we make that the emphasis and we magnify that out, and I'm sure you've seen this in your business experiences as a leader, we talk about the messy middle, but it's kind of like the messy stuff is constant. It's and the more we can do to be humble or take an approach that opens up possibilities, it changes things. Yeah.
Yeah, I like when I hear you say messy stuff. I think you're talking about the human nuances and behaviors that you have to kind of formulate to create the culture. That's what you're referring to.
Yeah,
right. And, it's funny. I was thinking about this the other day, Chris, when I'm in EO Entrepreneurs Organization, and I've joined a new group, and I was in Boston last week. Goldchester, actually, I think I'm saying it right. Gloucester. I'm going to mess that.
Yeah,
right, just above Boston. Anyway, met with this group, and it reminded me then, and continues to remind me when I talk to other entrepreneurs that may not have their focus on culture as much as client development and operations. And I get all that, but not an equal, like to me that the stool's wobbling the wrong side because there's a lag of people and culture that they're not focused on as much as the other two. And I find that when I talk to entrepreneurs that aren't focused on that, their biggest challenge, the phone rings all the time for me. Ron, I'm dealing with this thing. It's always people, people, people. I don't have those challenges. Doesn't mean I don't have as frequently and as deep and messy. It's less messy. It's short-term pain for long-term gain. I don't have those types of challenges, even through scale. Do you see that? Are you seeing the same type of trend?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think what you're probably also doing is there's building blocks that have been really pressure tested, or that you have put in the work to create a sensibility. And I can tell, I mean, you have, great countenance, a great approach. And, I think that dynamic of relationships, we know over the course of time in a lifetime, Harvard's done these 80-year longitudinal studies about this, is like, and it shows that happiness, or call it everything, satisfaction, success is relationships, right? Full stop.
That's a belonging in relationships and trust, right?
Yeah. And, I'll give you an example. Yeah. To your point about the founders, like I was talking to this friend of mine, he's an advisor for a variety of startups. And there's this one that it's a breakthrough idea. It's super innovative. They're probably going to reinvent the entire market around Bitcoin mining and how it works, and just like get to 1/10 of, the speed and it's 1/10 of the digital footprint. So it's a big opportunity that they have. And yet the founder is like, just trying to set up meetings on the weekend and just random, like right before. And this advisor's like, it's not like, okay. He's trying to frame up, like, you gotta hone in on how you're taking a methodical approach with intention to your team and to your, to advisors like me. And I think it was just one of those, to your point, where it's like, and this matters for founders. Like, if you take a scattered approach, it's not, there's not intention around it, but the more intention they can put in it, especially when it relates to people, whether it's an advisor or their staff, or people that work for them, people can feel it. Right. And it matters, a lot. Yeah.
So, I know you've done work with startups, and I want to dig into that. I've got some questions about that, but I want to go back to Disney and Apple for a second. You started to mention some things around Disney, of what I heard you say was very grandfather, I'll call it strong, foundational, old roots. But the counterbalance to that was maybe bureaucracy can't change much because they're so rooted in old foundations. So I'm curious, anything you would add from a need to move on from Disney? And then I want to do the same thing with Apple. So what else did you see that is like, wow, that if I'm going to build a company, I'm also going to lean into the attribute or the strategy of X, and I'm going to leave behind Y. And then I want to run for Apple too, objectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Disney was great. It still is great at essentially, I'd say creating happiness, or creating an experience that's singular, right? That just is all about magic. And I think that stays true, generally speaking. Their challenge, in fact, they paid consultants to come in and analyze the whole culture. And they did a one slider, right, that said, "You're too nice." And there was but it was in the context of, they're not having the challenging conversations. Like, they weren't.
Sorry, Chris, was that getting in the way of performance? So the consultant said, look, you could be performing much better. You're just too nice, Well,
what it was they would have meetings where they're supposed to work through some jugular issue or some challenge, but they do, the leaders would kind of intentionally do prep meetings. Then they do after meetings. And so you had all these meetings happening where the issues should have just been dealt with in the meeting. Right. And Pixar, Ed Catmull talks about this in his book a bit, because he was called, then he got to be president of Disney Animation, and they infused the Pixar way, you could say, which was much more candor and, with respect. Right. But you can have both. And I think they weren't always willing to make that trade-off. And, that makes it hard, because then you have a lot of passive aggressive behaviors. And I hope they're getting better at this. I know that with Pixar, it helped a lot. And, some of those acquisitions, bringing that infusion of culture, and if I get into Apple, it's like, well, one of the things that makes them great, and that Pixar embraced, and they're both related to Steve, is they call it, Steve called it the rock tumbler, right? Which is debate. These stones polished together, and, if they may have rough edges, but it all works together, for the better. And, I think that's true. That's one of the strengths of Apple culture, and that you could have people show up in a room and have
they need radical candor to have debate, honest debate. And so he was also a fan of that, and that was infused in the culture, right? Or it seemed
That's right. And I think there's an element to that, and we call it, it's about being brave, right? We call it brave space or being brave together. And because if you're willing to challenge, and also not make, I think being brave enough too, to not make it about you, right? Or not making it about your perspective. And, they say Steve could do this. He'd present a point of view, and, halfway through a meeting, he'd do a 180, disagree with himself, and people would say, whoa. Like, and no, that's like whiplash, right? Most people think, hey, the CEO's got to know it all, and they're going to stay with their point of view. Like, no, he's like, that's a better idea. So he changed his mind. And I think, we talk about this in the book a bit, is it's not just listening to understand, Covey would say, and that's true, but listening also, with a willingness to change our mind.
Right.
And to get the proper context to do that. And I think both of those things are true. But it really, that's a superpower, that Apple has. And that explains some of the success of their products.
And what would you leave behind? What was your experience? You'd say, I wouldn't bring that forward. And why?
Well, when I got hired in, it was, they were already the most valuable company on earth, but what we saw was, they had grown significantly. And so where you had one person as a team leader over an organization of, let's say 10, they were now leading 1,000, just an example, or 100, right? A lot more people. And so they had vertical strength of depth, technical expertise, and they could do this across, but the teams were getting so big. It was very, very difficult, very weighty. And, they also have elements of secrecy and what gets shared, what doesn't, so that you have surprise at the end when a product gets launched. But all this was kind of getting in the way. What we did was we really amplified. So it was going from, hey, we're great at thinking different, and that's foundational. Innovating personally, great, right? Or as a team, let's get better at working different together. So that was their next level, their future culture. And then we had to identify and kind of heat map who are the most innovative leaders and teams here, and extract their first principles. And that was what we set as the roadmap. And one of those things, for example, was this leader we sat down, he leads 4,000 engineers, and they do all the cool stuff, right? The cameras and the phones and, Face ID. We're like, his name's Lin Young. So said, what, how do you think about yourself, right? What's your leadership philosophy? He said, I'm a coach. And, for him to say that just out of the gate is pretty interesting. Right. And then, so what's your approach? Like, what would you say are your principles? And he said, I think about this way. He goes, I get in a room and I'm having a conversation, and, people's ideas are like their kids. And if I care as much or more about their kids as I care about mine, then magic's going to happen. And, and then he distilled that down further. He said, we think about bias as a bad thing. There's training for that. He goes, but I think about it like this. He said, I focus on being biased towards others' ideas. And that's like empathy, right? That's powerful. Right. And I thought that was a really interesting, and then principles, right? So we captured that. We're like, well, this is how this company, can move into the future. And so, we brought like the brain trust concept at Pixar that works for building movies. We saw that we were doing one at Apple in the camera team, and it was very successful. And so, as an example, the AirPods team was kind of struggling. There was a lot of things happening as far as escalations and challenges. So we created an AirPods brain trust based on the same principles. And quite simply, it's you establish a cross-staff meeting once a week. Egos off the table, building blocks on the table. You have all the functional partners there, and then you do the stuff we're talking about. People are just very clear about, hey, here's where I'm at. Here's what I need. Here's how I can help you. Like they're looking out for each other. So there's actual team sensibility about cross function. And this doesn't, it sounds like, oh yeah, obviously like everybody should be doing this. Like, of course, like, no, it doesn't always happen. For some reason you have these silos, and because of the expert model of expertise, people will double down on, hey, I'm the accounting, or I'm software, they're hardware. We all do our thing. But anyway, it was transformative. Yeah.
It's interesting. And so I want to go back to the startup world because you've done a lot of work with startups, right? And it's funny. I think most people view startups as, oh, the culture has to be great. Like, I've had people leave me in the past that, went to a startup and it maybe wasn't quite what they thought. And I think that's just common, like, oh, it's energizing and chaotic and crazy. And there's certainly some of that stuff. And of course, it always depends on the leader or leaders. But I'm curious from your experience, where does this culture start to break down? What doesn't work with startups? What are you constantly seeing? Is it that they don't create a foundation? Like, where's the pieces that break down in startup world?
Yeah, I mean, and it's hard because I think they have to create, a product or a service that is meaningful, and so I see that if the speed to do that overtakes the intention of building the proper partnerships across their team, whether it's with the founders themselves, or others, like then it's going to have some trouble, right? They're going to run into some challenges that could be devastating, right? Because if people, especially like, let's say the founders or the key people, the key talent there, like if they don't feel like, hey, this is a place that I'm able to do my best work, and it's, and granted, it's hard, right? Startups are hard. But if they don't feel that way, they're likely to leave. They're likely to not be part of that. And then if you lose that, it's like, what do you have? I think that's probably one of the most underestimated things. Cause like usually it's like, well, we just need a good idea, get some funding. They're like, yeah, but the team, that's really everything. I mean, you look at a band, it's like, you don't have, the guy playing the guitar or the bass or the drum, like they leave, they're not part of it. Then you got a guy who's just singing at the microphone, and good luck,
But you bring up a great point about the band analogy because I think as a startup, you have one, maybe two founders that have to play 9 instruments, right? And then let's assume we're bootstrapping and trying to figure out, and then we hire another person, and now there's 3 of us playing 9 instruments. Eventually, you need expertise. And my experience is that's when the first, like maybe not the first, but that it's got to be a breakdown piece where you don't know what you don't know. And so if I had to rewind the Ron Lovett 1.0, 2.0, speaking of 1.0, I'd say, look, everybody, this is what it is. We know that we don't have the true expertise here, and we're going to do our best. But while we're building this, let's do the best to find a lane here, because otherwise we're all gone. Like so I'd be that transparent, that kind of radical transparency of, the office manager, the accountant, and the marketing person. And then eventually it's like, we need a marketing person and an office manager. And if that person isn't an expertise of one of those 3, they're gone, and then it's this, you treat your people like garbage and you're just chewing them up, spitting them out. I mean, whatever the version of the story is, but I find that's really challenging. Do you see that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you're getting at, I heard the term recently was founder mode, and, right. They linked it to Steve a bit, Brian Chesky at Airbnb. And I guess he was talking about, there's people online talking about it. And I think it has that feeling, right? Where you're like, this is, for those of us that are parents, like, this is my baby, right? And I want it to grow in the right way, and just in the same way, care and feeding of, right? It's like, well, you got to give it, and teach the right things at the right time, right? And then as a child grows, it's like, well, let's expand the perspective and what it can do, what the child can do, and boy or girl, but like what
support it needs.
Yeah, because like I think those things get forgotten. Brian made a point, some conference he was, or Chesky of Airbnb. He's like, the difference between that manager mode of, and is like somebody just parachuting in on a mountain that was already created, and like, they don't even have the context of what happened. And so they're just like suddenly saying, oh, well, we got to hike this other mountain. But, it's like, it's not the same. And this is an argument for founders, but I think for like, that's why the founder mode moniker, I think, is sticking, because you're saying, hey, I think anybody can opt into that. So if and we've seen it, right? We've seen people show up and lead a company as a startup or as a medium size or large, and they just have that mindset.
Right.
I think it's easier if the person is the founder, but you can have it. And that matters. And then on this note too, of like, does a leader really care in terms of like who their team is? Because on the one hand, it's like, well, of course, but if they just see it as the requirements of a product or service, that's very different, I think, than saying, hey, it's the perpetual motion machine, right? Or like that Steve quote, or Ed or others, Ed that started Pixar, when they ask like, what's your favorite product, right? Or whatever, right? Movie. It's like, it's the culture. It's the team, right? So that answer that it's the team.
Yeah. I agree. I would also add too, like, I think like I've invested in some startups in the past. And one thing that I've noticed with new startups, and I think this is lacking for leadership broadly, but I don't think I would write another check unless I'm comfortable that the leader, and this is a top ask, by the way, and I think it's very challenging because I think even senior leaders suck at this, is the ability to have difficult conversations with people and be kind and leave them feeling better than when you started. That is like that's a pandemic of its own with leadership. I find senior leaders I'm sure at Fortune 500s, they just are challenged with that. But I know that it is, I've invested in some startups and been close to some, and that's the make or break. They can't, there's this like family mentality. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I'm going to let it all crash before I let someone down by a tough conversation, which I'm avoiding. The whole thing's going to implode. Would you agree, disagree? You seeing something else?
Yeah. And, given human nature, I think we always have this, and I think, you're absolutely right. But like given human nature too, it's like we have this tendency to like live in the extremes of, how we think about things, right? Like, okay. And this is like the battle between the heart and mind, let's say, right? So you can either be, the tough execution performance person, or you're the compassionate, heart, we see this show up in politics. Oh yeah. Facts don't care about your feelings. And the other side, it's like, well, your feelings, feelings don't care about facts, and the other way around, right? This whole battle. Yeah. And, it's like, well, wait a minute. What if you can have both, right? What if the answer, the synthesis in between that co-creative solution based on principles is that you can do both, and that the best founders, the best teams, the best companies actually do both. So let's take, NVIDIA, for example, who's happened to have a pretty good track record, last couple of years. And fortunately enough, my son told me to invest in them like 2 or 3 years ago. So that turned out well. I ignored his advice. This is my son, about going in on GameStop like a couple of years before that. And it was totally random, but somehow he knew. So I was like, well, it's probably going to turn out right. NVIDIA did. And
you buy him something? I hope you bet. I hope
he's on. Yeah, he's squared away for sure.
You're never going to hear the end of that, no matter what.
No matter
when he asks for money, he's pulling that card out. You're done, Chris.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But you look at like Jensen Huang, right? He started this company like out of Denny's. He was working there, and then, or I think he met with some friends, but he was doing like, washing toilets, all these hard stuff, all these hard, but he talks about, one of the things that really strikes me was this conversation. They asked him about, hey, you said it's uncomfortable to fire people. And he said, yes. He goes, I don't like to do that. He goes, instead, what I'll do is he's like, it's like, I'd rather like torture them to be great, to become great. Right. And, it's a little tongue in cheek, but the reality is like, if we keep those expectations so ultra high, as we have the compassion, to help get people there. And this is, I think it is, I mean, I don't know that we'd say like, hey, cause to your point, like the easy way to write things off and be like, well, it's like family. And that assumption is like, hey, it's just, it's all unconditional love and there's no expectations of anybody. But I don't know that
that's
like,
BS.
It is
right?
BS.
That's not true.
It is BS in family too, right? And as a parent,
that's right.
Well, don't do that.
But I'll say ish, because you can't just kick your, like, I don't know. I'm generalizing, but I understand when, I think it was Jody in our team, someone had brought that to my attention that said like, team is a better word than family, because family is BS, because you can't punt your daughter and just say, look, your 3-year-old. I joked before the podcast, I was getting a restraining order on my 3-year-old. Like, I can't do that actually. Like, that's a joke. Right. And so,
right.
So there is this, I do agree with that. And then, but to your point, it's interesting because I use a similar sentence in our company, which says, lift someone to greatness or lift them out of the organization, but one or the other, right?
Right.
Push them to greatness or push them out the door. And that's actually what I say. And I agree with that, but that's in a team environment. That's what you should do as a team. You push your teammates to greatness or go get a new team, you know?
Right. And I think that the onus of, as a leader, like it should feel excruciating, because in the sense of like, we talk about the hero sacrifice earlier. It's like, that is the sacrifice. It's like, I am doing everything I can to help this person be successful. Right. And to help the team be successful. And I think about, okay. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about leadership, Michael Jordan, right. And then, those who have seen The Last Dance, it captures all of that spirit of like, and by the way, I don't care what they say about LeBron. I mean, Michael, there's just nobody compares with the guy. He had an extra cushion of air at all times. But beyond that, here's a guy who he realized his limitations at some point, right? He was hitting the playoffs, but he didn't get to, where he wanted to be in terms of championships until he learned the very thing we're talking about, which was making the team great. And there's one of my favorite moments in that Last Dance series. I think it's episode 7. And they're interviewing him and they ask him like, hey, you were tough on some player. And like he and Steve Kerr had a, back and forth. It was heavy, right? And of course, but look at Steve. It's like, well, he's had since then, great track record, one with the Warriors. Jordan would set him up for these perfect shots, right? He hit the threes to win the games. And you looked at all those other players, Paxson, Bill Cartwright, Scottie Pippen, who became great, right? He was on Dream Team and Michael helped make that happen. But there's a moment in that there's a clip there where like people said you were pretty hard on the other people, and he was. It's like, and he says, yeah, he goes, well, I just wanted to win. And he said, I wanted the team to feel like what it felt like to win. And then he starts to get emotional. He's like tearing up because this is his soul. Right. And he's like, okay, turn the cameras off. Like he's done. Right. That's his moment. But it gets into his core of where he is truly brave. And, hey, it could show up differently for different players. Like Steph Curry does it a little differently, maybe not quite as abrasive. I think the world's changed too in terms of what's expected there, but you get similar results. And, he's a guy or Steph in the glory days of Warriors, that Steve Kerr would say, well, he's unbelievably humble off the court and incredibly like arrogant on the court. But like that combo of like what you can accomplish as a team. But I think that team centered too. The other thing is like in interviews, Caitlin Clark does this too. It's like they get asked all these questions like, okay, you hit all these records, you've been successful. And you get some players who are the rock star who in an interview otherwise would be like, well, we're going to win because I'm the best player. Like, okay, that's whatever. But then the ones that actually do win, the ones that have dynasties that are constant greatness, it's a lot of we. They're talking about other people. They're talking about the team.
And I wonder, if I was to have Mike on the podcast, I would question him on his reflection on the delivery. And what I mean by that is, I keep making the statement in everything. I believe that things should be absolutely 100% focused and stubborn on vision, but flexible on execution, even when it comes to leadership. And with Michael, I don't think there's a movement of winning. It's win at all. Well, I'm going to just take away at all costs for a sec, but win, win, win. But how I execute that message to you, Chris, might be different than Sally and Tommy and Terry, because I need to, like a leader, I need to speak your language and connect with you in a way. Because I think what Michael did, and again, I don't have all the facts, but my observation was, this is how I communicate, and it's going to rub some people really wrong and too bad, so sad. And it's going to rub people, that's my authentic self. But almost similar to my mother, my mother, you say, well, this is me, like it or leave it. And I say, yeah, right. But if multiple people say that you're an asshole, then you should adjust if you're the problem, and so there's a little bit of that, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm not,
you're right. I think, and there was a time, I think during, like, let's say that time window. And by the way, I think his for that role, just as being kind of the best player that was leading the team through that. That's one thing, but like Phil Jackson couldn't have taken that approach, right, as the coach, and Steve Kerr couldn't have taken it with the Warriors. And I think if you look at what is a quintessential leader of a team,
but doesn't Bill Belichick take that approach? And I don't know, but isn't he like a hard ass all the time? Isn't that his approach a little bit?
I don't know either, but
Football guy.
Yeah, I have heard some things. I mean, I think football is, also tough, but you look at like an Andy Reid, right, with the Chiefs, and he's probably more like a Steve Kerr or a Phil Jackson, where it's like he's empowering people,
Right.
they're driving. And so, and hey, maybe either model can work. I mean, you look back far enough in college basketball, you had Bobby Knight throwing chairs, and he was somehow successful at that. I don't know how, but I think his intensity of what he wanted of winning, but then Coach K right after, who by the way ended up surpassing him in wins, had a very different approach, right? More empowerment of the team. And I think that's probably more about the future. Like that's more
right.
Yeah.
And Chris, when I think about Michael, and if I break that down, right, and I'm no expert in this, but I'm just thinking critically about this, I guess. And if I think back to that, if Michael's pushing Steve Kerr, there is a risk to that type of one size fits all communication to pull someone to greatness. The risk is maybe I deflate him. He becomes insecure. He misses every shot tonight because I pressed the wrong button, and I've actually gotten his head, his mojo's down, versus lifting him up to say, no, I'm going to get this. Someone's going to step up to that, but others may not. And so there's some risk, and I'm sure that there would have been some risk and reward to that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the sensitivity to, and you could look at like a Steve Jobs, right? And he was on his own hero's journey too. He got fired from his own company, was in the wilderness. He had to learn some lessons in rebuilding and starting over with Next and Pixar, frankly, about compassion and empathy.
Right.
And, right. I mean, and there's actually another standing question to all of this, which is, as great as Michael is, right? Michael Jordan, he never did coach a team, and his Hornets didn't really have a championship, didn't have a lot of success. So, I think if you look at him as a person, as a player, the fact of like, he said he would practice, he would treat it like a game.
Right.
So it's like a next level, so as a player, he was fully optimized. But I think if we're getting to the question of like, okay, how does a coach do this? How do they do it over time? What's based on principle, right? That doesn't go away. Yeah, I think some of those things you have to shave off and say, well, right. We also live in a more sensitive time. I mean, you look at, like a Steve even versus a Tim Cook now. Tim Cook is much more, I'd say socially aware. Steve was socially aware, but like he's cued in or dialed into situations, and his understanding is far more broad of what's going on. Right. He's much more of a listener. But, Steve prepared him for that. And it's like there was some intuition about that. But I think it tells us too, like, well, maybe that's part of the leadership of the future. It could also, I mean, you could also argue that it's situational, right? The depends answer,
And on that note, I better move topics because I don't watch any sports. I know that's the only thing I used to watch with the Bulls. So half these people you're talking about, I'm like, yes, of course. Yes, that person. I can't keep up with you here. I got to move topics.
Yeah, no worries. That's okay.
So I want to move to this. We didn't mention this, but you've got your own podcast, Lead with a Question podcast. Just give us an overview of what that is, and then I've got a question around that.
Yeah, we've the roots of that are simply we asked Ed Catmull, who started Pixar, what his leadership philosophy was, and he said, I used to go around. He's a PhD, he's a smart guy. He's like, I'd answer questions to everybody, and just they all ask me whatever. And he said, I was exhausted all the time. And he goes, I wasn't empowering anybody, and so he went on his wife told him to go on a meditation retreat, and so he did this for 7 days, and all he could do is ask people questions and listen. Those were the rules. And after 2 or 3 days, he said it drove him crazy, but he stayed, the 7 days. And he said it changed his life, and it changed him as a leader. And, here we are talking to him, and he was just listening. It was like going to be a 30-minute conversation turned to 3 hours. He was actually just asking great questions. So I thought that's powerful. So the podcast is based in that. So we asked him, what's his leadership? He said, I lead with a question. So that principle of lead with a question is our first meta principle in the book. We believe that ties into the future, because we look at these waves of efficiency, effectiveness, which is that kind of Covey timeframe. Well, this bigger wave of the future is co-creation. And, AI tells us that, well, it's doing a lot of things that a lot of people used to do, right? And this is happening so fast. In the tech world, we've seen massive layoffs, and then they're going back and saying, we're just going to hire in AI people. But what the future really needs is people that are attuned to, curiosity, and leading with questions. And so we've had a lot of different conversations, a lot of different people that run different companies, Adobe, other places, and just tried to understand and get a better sense of like, these are people that kind of, they're living in the future. They come off the DeLorean, 30 years from now, and they're like, here's how you do it. And,
right.
We just stay curious about what it is they, how they go about it, I guess.
Yeah, I love that and love the topic. We recently had Bob McDonald on, who's CEO and then chairman of Procter & Gamble. He was our last guest, actually. And he's also has this program at West Point, which we've had 2 of our leaders go down, and then was able to spend some time with Bob. If you haven't had him, I would suggest having him on. He's a fantastic leader. And so
that'd be great.
Let's wrap with this, Chris. What is the most powerful, interesting question that's come out of your podcast? What's your favorite question?
Wow. That is a great question. I think, a part statement, part question. I'm thinking of Scott Belsky, he's a chief product officer of Adobe. And I guess for some reason it's on my mind, but he was basically saying, and he did a startup himself. So before all that, he created a company called Behance, and it's basically creative portfolios online. And everybody was saying like, you guys are crazy. So he's working with his team trying to do this, something that everybody thought was impossible. And he said, you have to kind of raise the flag with your team and lead this charge with them and inspire them and be inspired together. But something else that he mentioned was, you have to find a place to where you're kind of on the edge of reason. And so it's kind of this question of like, how do you stay on the edge of reason where you understand the context of the past, but you're challenging things into the future to become different. And I think it's a hard place to be, but it matters, and we also get inspired by doing something that's truly original, right? As a team, like together. And I think that's what helps create a beautiful future. Right? Any of the products or services that we see in the world, and this could be in any industry. I mean, I was just talking to somebody who they work with a startup that's they saw school buses and they're like, school buses have not been innovated ever, right? For like 100 years. And they created these EV school buses that are way better, right? And they're selling like crazy and they're great, right? It's a much better experience. It's like almost a luxury experience for these kids who have been sitting on these like basically rock chairs. You've done it. We've done it, right? Yeah. And I'm like, wow. And I just think how exciting it is, that possibility of if people are willing to stay in that, and we call it the messiness or that hero sacrifice, but the edge of reason to say, we're in this together. And if we do it collectively, we can lead that brave together future together.
That's great. Well, Chris, look, it's been fantastic having you as a guest today. I've really enjoyed the discussion. Love the work that you do. And where can our listeners find you?
Thanks so much, Ron. It's been great to be here. So bravecore.co is our website. There's a lot of articles and videos and podcasts, different things, and the book, of course, Brave Together is on Amazon, and there's actually a video book that just came out too, Lit Book Videos released, that captures the essence of the book as well, and we're excited about that too. But love to connect with people, and we love to work with leaders and teams and organizations too. So.
Fantastic. Well, my friend, good to see you, and let's keep in touch, and love the work you do.
Thanks so much, Ron.
For more information about Chris Deaver and his work, please visit bravecore.co. To learn more about our books or the Scaling Culture Masterclass on building resilient, high-performing teams, please visit scalingculture.org. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a comment and share this podcast with a friend or colleague. We'll be back soon with another inspiring guest.